Welcome back. A new survey showing a majority of Canadians think that boycotting American-made goods or travel to the U.S. is helpful.
7 months after grocery stores in British Columbia quietly erased United States agricultural products from their shelves, what began as a local retail decision has evolved into a warning signal for Washington that exposes how a trade war, tariff threats, and political rhetoric can inflict real economic damage without a single law being passed. Across one of Canada's most influential provinces, American fruits, vegetables, and fresh produce have vanished. This is not a supply disruption, not a logistics failure, and not a seasonal adjustment. Retailers describe it plainly as a boycott. For the United States, the consequences are no longer abstract. Export routes have collapsed, inventory has gone unsold, and farmers in Washington, Oregon, California, and Idaho are absorbing losses that ripple through trucking, storage, and rural employment. Canada has long been the largest agricultural export destination for the United States, and British Columbia has served as a critical gateway for that trade. When that gateway closed, it did more than disrupt shipments. It forced a structural rethink of North American food supply chains, accelerated diversification away from the United States, and tested the limits of American economic influence during a period of heightened tariffs and trade war uncertainty. What makes this situation more dangerous is not how quickly it started, but how quietly it has lasted, and what comes next may be far more damaging than what has already happened. Listen to the end, because the real shock lies in why this boycott is proving so difficult for the United States to reverse. As the boycott extended month after month, its impact shifted from store shelves to the foundation of the United States agricultural economy. British Columbia did not pause purchases, it rebuilt supply chains to avoid future dependence on American produce. Once that transition began, reversal became costly and unnecessary. For United States farmers dependent on speed and certainty, trade war uncertainty and tariff risk turned a reliable export route into a liability. Shipments stalled, margins collapsed, and alternative buyers failed to appear at scale. Consumers adapted faster than expected, and new suppliers filled the gap. What makes this moment dangerous is not what was lost, but what was replaced. And the next development explains why this shift may be far harder for Washington to stop than any formal tariff dispute. This boycott did not emerge from trade spreadsheets alone. It was accelerated by a sharp deterioration in political trust between Canada and the United States, at a moment when the trade war narrative was already shaping public opinion on both sides of the border. In British Columbia, politics did not remain abstract. It entered grocery aisles, pricing decisions, and brand reputations. Over the past year, repeated tariff threats, aggressive trade language, and unpredictable border enforcement changed how Canadian consumers viewed the United States as a partner. What once felt like a stable, rules-based relationship began to appear volatile. For a province that values economic autonomy and risk control, that shift mattered. Grocery retailers found themselves caught between long-standing supply habits and a rapidly changing customer mood. Shoppers began asking questions that had rarely surfaced before. Where is this produce from? Why are we still relying on American suppliers? What happens if tariffs escalate again? The origin label, once neutral, became charged. Continuing to stock United States agricultural products started to carry reputational risk. For retailers operating on narrow margins, consumer trust is not optional, it is survival. At the same time, operational confidence declined. Importers reported inconsistent inspections, longer clearance times, and rising compliance costs at the United States border. Even without new tariffs being formally applied, uncertainty itself became expensive. From a business perspective, replacing American suppliers was no longer an act of protest. It was a form of risk management. Retailers began reframing their decisions internally. Diversification was described as prudence. Local sourcing was presented as resilience. Alternative imports from Mexico, South America, and Europe were no longer backup plans, but primary strategies. Once these contracts were signed and logistics adjusted, the economic incentive to return to the United States produce weakened dramatically. What makes this phase especially serious for Washington is that no government directive drove it. This was not Ottawa imposing counter tariffs. It was the private sector responding to social pressure and political signals. That makes the outcome harder to negotiate and harder to reverse. There is no single policy lever to pull, no announcement that can instantly restore trust. The boycott became normalized. Silence replaced debate. And normalization is where long-term damage sets in, because the most consequential impact is still unfolding. What began as a political reaction inside one Canadian province is now exposing how deeply the United States depends on confidence, not just contracts, to sustain its trade position. And the next development shows how this loss of confidence is translating into economic consequences that extend well beyond agriculture into employment, pricing, and regional stability across the United States. The economic consequences of this boycott do not stop at the farm gate. As American agricultural exports to British Columbia disappeared, the pressure began cascading through multiple layers of the United States economy, exposing how interconnected and fragile these systems have become during a prolonged trade war environment. For farmers in Washington, Oregon, California, and Idaho, Canada has never been a secondary market. It has been a stabilizing force. When that demand weakened, prices did not gently adjust. They dropped sharply at the source. Fresh produce cannot be stored indefinitely, and once shipments miss their delivery windows, their value deteriorates rapidly. What followed was not simply lost revenue, but forced decisions that cut deep into operations. Entire harvests were redirected at a loss, downgraded for processing, or discarded altogether. These losses moved quickly beyond agriculture. Trucking firms that specialized in cross-border routes saw contracts evaporate. Cold storage facilities faced rising costs with shrinking throughput. Packaging plants reduced shifts. Seasonal labor demand fell. In rural communities already under strain from rising input costs and climate volatility, the shock translated into reduced income and growing employment insecurity. For consumers inside the United States, the effects are less visible but no less real. When export outlets shrink, surplus supply can temporarily depress prices, followed by volatility as production contracts. Over time, farmers respond by planting less, investing less, and hiring less. That adjustment cycle does not stabilize markets. It amplifies swings, making food pricing more unpredictable and rural economies more vulnerable. What makes this situation especially concerning for policymakers is that none of these outcomes were triggered by formal tariffs. No legislation was passed, no retaliatory duties were announced, yet the economic damage rivals what would normally be expected from an escalated trade war. This exposes a blind spot in Washington's trade calculus. Soft power, trust, and consumer sentiment now move markets as decisively as policy tools. As British Columbia entrenches alternative suppliers, the window for recovery narrows. Each month that passes without American produce on Canadian shelves makes the separation more permanent. And permanence is where the true cost lies. Because if this model of disengagement proves sustainable, it raises a far more dangerous question for the United States. What happens when similar dynamics emerge in other Canadian provinces or in other allied markets, watching closely from the sidelines? The answer to that question reshapes not just agriculture, but the future leverage of American trade itself. From Washington's perspective, this situation is deeply uncomfortable precisely because it does not fit the traditional trade war playbook. There are no official tariffs to negotiate away, no formal disputes to bring before a trade panel, and no single decision maker in Ottawa to pressure. What British Columbia demonstrates is that the balance of power in trade has shifted quietly but decisively toward consumers, retailers, and decentralized market actors. For the United States, the immediate loss is not only export volume, it is credibility. Canada has long been described by American policymakers as the most reliable trading partner of the United States. When a Canadian province is willing to sustain a prolonged boycott without government coercion, that assumption weakens. In a trade war environment, reliability becomes as valuable as price, and unpredictability carries a measurable economic penalty. Internationally, the signal has not gone unnoticed. Exporters in Mexico, South America, and parts of Europe have stepped into the gap left by American suppliers. These countries are not merely providing stopgap shipments. They are negotiating longer-term contracts, investing in logistics, and embedding themselves into Canadian retail systems. Once that infrastructure is in place, displacement becomes permanent. In global trade, absence creates opportunity, and opportunity rarely returns unused. For Washington, this raises a strategic dilemma. Aggressive tariff rhetoric may play well domestically, but it also conditions allies to hedge. Canada is not severing ties with the United States, but it is clearly reducing exposure. That distinction matters. Hedging is quieter than confrontation, yet far more durable. It is how trade relationships are rewritten without headlines. The deeper concern is precedent. If a consumer-driven boycott can impose meaningful costs on the United States without triggering diplomatic escalation, similar strategies become attractive elsewhere. Other partners may conclude that disengagement is safer than negotiation. In that scenario, the trade war ceases to be a series of disputes and becomes a slow erosion of influence. For American producers, this is not an abstract geopolitical debate. It translates into lost shelf space, lost contracts, and shrinking leverage abroad. For policymakers, it challenges a long-held belief that allies will tolerate volatility from the United States as long as markets remain open. British Columbia suggests otherwise. It shows that access can be withdrawn quietly, patiently, and with lasting effect. And this leads to the most troubling implication of all. If this is how trade pressure now works, then the United States may be facing a future where tariffs are no longer the main weapon and where influence is lost not in one dramatic break, but through a series of silent exits that are nearly impossible to reverse. What is unfolding between British Columbia and the United States is not a temporary trade dispute. It is a structural warning about how trade wars evolve when trust collapses and when tariffs are no longer the primary instrument of pressure. The long-term implications extend far beyond agriculture, reaching into how the United States manages alliances, supply chains, and its own economic security. For decades, American trade strategy relied on a simple assumption. Close partners would tolerate volatility because integration benefited everyone. Canada fit that model perfectly. Geography, infrastructure, and history made disengagement seem impractical. British Columbia now demonstrates that this assumption no longer holds. When political rhetoric and tariff uncertainty raise perceived risk, partners do not wait for formal escalation. They adapt quietly. From a strategic standpoint, this shift is dangerous for the United States. Trade wars were once fought through tariffs, quotas, and negotiations. Those tools were visible and reversible. What is happening now is different. Retailers and consumers are redesigning supply chains from the ground up. Once those systems stabilize, restoring previous trade flows becomes costly and unnecessary. Influence fades without confrontation. The agricultural sector is only the first exposure point. If disengagement proves economically viable in food supply chains, the logic spreads. Energy, manufactured components, and consumer goods become the next candidates. Canada has already increased investment in domestic greenhouse production and diversified imports. Each step reduces sensitivity to future tariffs and reduces leverage for Washington. This is not retaliation. It is insulation. For American producers, the long-term risk is market erosion that does not trigger alarms until it is irreversible. Losing shelf space is not like losing a tariff case. There is no appeal process. Once buyers build relationships elsewhere, price competitiveness alone may not bring them back. Reliability becomes the deciding factor, and reliability is shaped by politics as much as logistics. For policymakers, the challenge is more complex. Escalating tariffs in response to disengagement could accelerate the very behavior Washington wants to prevent. De-escalation requires restoring confidence. Yet confidence cannot be legislated. It must be earned through consistency, predictability, and respect for partners. In a prolonged trade war climate, those qualities become scarce. There is also a domestic cost that is often underestimated. When American exporters lose stable markets, they respond by reducing investment. That affects employment, rural development, and long-term productivity. Over time, the United States risks becoming less competitive, not because of foreign barriers, but because of self-inflicted uncertainty. Trade wars do not always end with agreements. Sometimes they end with markets moving on. British Columbia's experience exposes a hard truth. Economic dependence cuts both ways. The United States has long viewed access to its market as leverage. What this boycott shows is that access to allied markets can be withdrawn just as effectively and without political drama. Quiet disengagement is harder to detect and harder to counter. The most unsettling aspect is that nothing about this strategy violates trade rules. No tariffs were imposed. No agreements were broken. This is market behavior responding to perceived risk. That makes it lawful, durable, and highly attractive to others watching closely. And this is where the story takes its most troubling turn. If British Columbia's approach becomes a template rather than an exception, the United States may soon discover that the next phase of the trade war is not fought in negotiations or headlines, but in silent decisions made far from Washington long before any response is possible. Because the final question is no longer whether the United States can win a trade dispute, it is whether it can stop allies from quietly deciding they no longer need to play at all. What has unfolded in British Columbia is not a dramatic rupture, but something far more consequential for the United States. It is a quiet recalibration of trust. 7 months without American agricultural products did not trigger shortages, panic, or political crisis in Canada. Instead, it normalized a new trading reality, one in which dependence on the United States is no longer assumed. For Washington, this should be a moment of reflection. Trade wars are often measured in tariffs imposed and concessions extracted. Yet this episode shows a different metric at work: confidence. Once it erodes, markets adjust without waiting for permission. Retailers move on. Consumers adapt. Supply chains settle into new patterns. And when that happens, leverage fades. The most sobering lesson is that none of this required formal retaliation. No tariffs were announced. No agreements were violated. The pressure emerged organically, driven by perception, political tone, and risk avoidance. That makes it harder to confront and nearly impossible to reverse with traditional tools. The question now facing the United States is not whether it can out-negotiate partners, but whether it can rebuild the trust that keeps them engaged in the first place. Because if allies can disengage quietly and succeed, the future of American trade power looks very different from the past. And that leads to the question every policymaker should be asking: is this a bold strategy or a risky mistake that the United States will only recognize when the exits are already closed?